So today our screencast topic. We're gonna be talking about segregation and segregation as it develops in the South post Civil War. So there's a lot of kind of interesting things about segregation. So we're really gonna kind of jump into the origins of segregation. So most people kind of associate segregation with the South, just like they associate slavery with the South. And as we learned earlier in our class, slavery wasn't just a Southern thing, and actually segregation is not just a Southern thing either, and it also has its origins in the North. So segregation actually starts in the pre-Civil War Northern society. Now, as we kind of learned earlier in our class, Northern society, it's predominantly white, especially pre-Civil War. So we're talking about somewhere in the range of 96 to 98% white. So they do have segregation to varying degrees in different states, and the laws vary by state in the North. But the best example I think can look at would be segregation in the United States Army. And so when you have these black regiments that start to come into the military, the most famous ones coming from Massachusetts, and also the earliest ones coming from Massachusetts, they're always going to be segregated, white and black. And segregation stays in the military for a very long time. We have segregated units all the way up through World War II. And so this is kind of an example of segregation starting in the North. Now, after the Civil War, things start to change. When you look at the 1870s and the 1880s in the North, segregation is going to end by law. So they're going to eliminate, state by state is going to kind of eliminate segregation in the North. And a lot of it has to do with the Republican Party gaining dominance throughout the Civil War and really gaining an upper hand in Northern politics. The Republican Party doesn't want to look hypocritical as far as they're imposing all of these new racial laws and this new racial justice on the South, and they can't kind of keep segregation and kind of keep separation of the races in the North. You know, they're passing acts like the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the 14th and 15th Amendments, and so they kind of have to kind of keep it all together and make sure that they're also kind of changing things in the North. So state by state, things start to kind of change in the North as far as segregation is concerned. Now, what I want you guys to keep in mind, the Civil War kind of plays the same role that the American Revolution did for slavery, but the Civil War plays that same role for northern states as far as segregation. If you remember, after the American Revolution, what starts to happen is the North starts to end slavery state by state. New Jersey and New York are going to be kind of the ones that hang on to slavery the longest, and they don't abolish it until right at the turn of the century, like 1799 and 1803. And it's a form of gradual emancipation when they do actually abolish it. But basically, state by state in the North, they're going to end segregation after the American Revolution. Now, the same thing is going to happen to segregation in the North after the Civil War. State by state, to varying degrees, they're going to end their practice of segregation. Now, again, kind of on the flip side, the American Revolution, the South does not get rid of slavery after the American Revolution. And after the Civil War, although they're forced to end slavery with the 13th Amendment, and they're forced to try and give black people rights in the South with the 14th and 15th Amendment, they're going to actually adopt segregation. So these wars kind of act as turning points for the North and kind of like wake-up calls to kind of live up to the ideals that they're putting forth in these documents, like in the Declaration of Independence, in the American Revolution, and in the Civil War, these amendments and these civil rights movements that they're trying to facilitate in the South. Now, what starts to happen in the North, even though they get rid of segregation by law, they still have a lot of what you would call de facto segregation, which means it's not institutionalized, it's not by law, but you do end up with a lot of de facto segregation, meaning that it just happens through housing, through real estate, where the races do not mingle. It's also very frowned upon socially, and so it's kind of just a social immoral. You just don't do this. You don't mix the races, either in the North or in the South. And so you do end up still with a lot of segregation in the North, but it's just not by law segregation. Now, what's going to start to happen in the South actually is going to adopt some of the old Northern segregation laws post-Civil War, post-Reconstruction. And so they model them after the Northern laws. And collectively, what these new segregation laws, these new separation of the races, these laws happen state by state, but collectively they're going to become known as the Jim Crow laws. And so this is going to be kind of the name that kind of takes place here, or it kind of gets this name in the South. Now, where the name comes from, Jim Crow was a character that was a stage character made up by this guy named T.D. Rice. And you're looking at the character right here. And the character was a part of these performances that were very common and very popular amongst Americans at the time, called blackface performances. And so what these white actors would do is they would paint their faces with this dark charcoal black, and they would get on stage and they would basically perform as if they were African Americans, but like caricatures of African Americans. And they would always kind of depict them as lazy and kind of indolent and ignorant, and they're basically making fun of black people in America. And so these were extremely popular. You had all of these troops, hundreds of them, that would tour America north and south. I mean, you're looking at a poster for one of them, the New Orleans Minstrels, and they would tour north and south and kind of make these performances. And so they were extremely popular. They even made it to Broadway. You had blackface performances on Broadway. And so this is where the Jim Crow laws, these segregation laws, get their name from. Now, in the South, it is going to be institutionalized segregation. So it is segregation backed up by both the state government and then later on by the federal government also in the post-Reconstruction era. So it is completely institutionalized, a part of the law. Separation of the races was a part of the laws in the South, in the southern states. Now, almost right away, black people in the South are going to start to challenge these Jim Crow laws because they look at it as violations of their newly gotten rights. Their rights through the Civil Rights Act, through the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and they're going to start to challenge these laws. So what you're looking at here is a picture from a later date. This is from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, when black people again started to challenge Jim Crow. But that's really the second wave of black people challenging the Jim Crow laws. The first wave happens right in this post-Reconstruction period with the newly freed men who are not willing to kind of accept a subservient role in American society. And so they base their claims off of the 14th Amendment, and specifically the separation clause in the 14th Amendment, and they're going to kind of base it off of the fact that the equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment is really what they're going to base it off of, which is the first clause in the 14th Amendment. Now, when they start to challenge it, the most famous example of a black person in the South challenging the Jim Crow laws is going to be the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. So in this case, you can kind of see it through the cartoon here, if you could kind of read along while I'm explaining. What happens is this man named Homer Plessy, he gets on a train. He buys a first-class ticket, and he's traveling through the South, and he goes through Louisiana, which has segregation laws. And he's sitting in his first-class seat, and the conductor kind of comes over to him and tells him basically, you can't sit here because you're black, you have to move. It's for whites only. And so he refuses to move, and he ends up getting arrested for refusing to comply with these segregation laws, these Jim Crow laws. Now, this should remind you of another famous case where somebody refused to give up their seat. And you look at it basically every day. This is the picture on your textbook. So this is again from the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, where you have Rosa Parks, who's on a public bus, and she refuses to kind of give up her seat on the bus. So Homer Plessy is kind of the predecessor of Rosa Parks, kind of a person who bought a ticket, refused to comply with these laws, refused to kind of move to a blacks-only car and kind of leave the whites-only car. So this case gets all the way to the Supreme Court. And so if I was you, I would just pause right here for a second and kind of read through the 14th Amendment, because it's going to become very important in our class. What does the 14th Amendment actually say? Because this is what Homer Plessy is basing his argument off of, that this is unconstitutional what you're doing. That's his claim, because he's going to say that it violates my rights under the 14th Amendment. You can't make me move. This is a violation of the Constitution. The Supreme Court doesn't exactly see it that way. what ends up happening here when he makes it all the way to the Supreme Court with his case, the majority opinion, they're going to rule of the 9 Supreme Court justices, it's going to be 8-1. They're going to rule against Homer Plessy. And their basis is going to kind of be the basis for segregation in the South for the next 70 years, 60 to 70 years. And it's going to be separate but equal. What the Supreme Court justices say, who are in favor of this majority opinion, they're going to say it is okay to separate the races as long as you give them equal facilities. So it's perfectly constitutional to separate people based off of race or maybe even ethnicity or other factors as long as you give them the same equal facilities, the same equal treatment under the law. Meaning, let's say, for example, you had segregated schools. According to this opinion in 1896, it's okay to have a black school and a white school as long as they get the same amount of funding, as long as they get the buildings are of equal quality, they get the same amount of textbooks, and the textbooks are updated as often in the white school as they are in the black school. That's kind of their basis here as far as their opinion. Now, there's one guy who kind of gives a stinging dissenting opinion to Plessy versus Ferguson, and this is going to be Justice Harlan. Now, he's an interesting individual here, Harlan. He was actually a Kentucky slave owner prior to the Civil War. And so it's surprising that he's going to be the guy that speaks out against their decision here to institutionalize and through the national government institutionalize segregation and say that it's okay. What he says here is that our Constitution is colorblind, and you cannot kind of separate out the races, because his argument here is that the history of black and white people in America is too intermingled. And by doing this, you're institutionalizing segregation and you're institutionalizing racism and race hate amongst the different groups in America. And you're setting us up for major conflict and major problems down the line. And in a lot of ways, Harlan's dissenting opinion is very pathetic as far as he sees kind of the problems that are going to happen in the future as a result of institutionalizing and accepting segregation, not just as de facto segregation in the North, but institutionalized, accepted segregation through the law and through the Constitution, he sees as a major, major mistake. And so that's where I'm going to kind of leave you guys. We're really going to kind of look at this in some detail tomorrow because it sets up the next 60 years of race relations in America. And it's really, again, a dark chapter and kind of a distinct and difficult interpretation of the Constitution that we're looking at here. So we're really going to get into some detail tomorrow. So I'll see you guys tomorrow in class.